Welcome back to educator.com. Today we're going to go over a sample multiple choice practice exam that's found on the AP website. This is actually the 21 question multiple choice sample exam, so it's not a full length exam, but we'll go over this 21 question multiple choice test. The link is found below, so you might want to print this copy out and you can follow along as I go over the answers. So let's proceed right to the material here. Question number one. Number one deals with comparative advantage. So make sure you understand this. This is one of the things that's also a topic in the AP Micro course. So this is probably one of the first things you learned in AP Macro as well. So it's good to brush up on this here. Okay, so the table above indicates the labor hours needed to produce a single unit of two commodities. Labor is the only factor used in the commodities. What must be true? Number one, country A has absolute advantage in both commodities, but comparative advantage in wheat as well. Number two, country B has absolute advantage in both commodities, but comparative advantage in the production of fish. And number three, mutually advantageous trade can occur between the two countries when 2.5 units of fish are exchanged for 1 unit of wheat. So let's take a look here. The data that they give you actually is labor hours. So country A and country B here, and you have fish and you have fish and you have wheat here. Now I'm going to convert this directly here. So what you have on your chart is different here. You're going to have 10 labor hours here, 20 labor hours, 20 labor hours, and 60 labor hours. So instead of putting it as inputs, I'm going to put this comparative advantage chart in outputs. So what I'm going to say is, if 60 labor hours are required to produce 1 wheat, then 1 wheat will be produced in 60 hours. Now, if 20 labor hours here produces 1, then 60 labor hours is going to be used to produce 3 wheat, and 3 fish are going to be produced at 20 labor hours, and in 10 labor hours, 6 fish can be produced here. So from this, we can actually find the answer. It's a little easier comparing the outputs than the inputs here. So we can say the following here. For country A, you can say that 6 fish equals 3 wheat. And so you divide by 3 here. So you get 1 wheat equals 2 fish. And find the reciprocal here. 1 fish equals 1/2 wheat. Okay, now let's take a look at country B. 1 wheat equals 3 fish. Directly here, you don't have to do any math. 1 wheat equals 3 fish. And 1 fish equals 1/3 wheat. And then again, you have all these equalities. Put it into a table here. So the table you're going to use here is the opportunity cost of 1 wheat, opportunity cost of 1 fish, and this is country A and country B. And let's just plug in the numbers here. Okay, so opportunity cost of 1 wheat for country A would be 2 fish. For country B, 1 wheat is 3 fish. And 1 fish would be 1/3 of a wheat right here. And 1 fish would be 1/2 of a wheat here. Now, how do you find comparative advantage? Comparative advantage is the lower of the 2 opportunity costs. So you want to circle the lower of the 2 here. So 2 fish is lower than 3. So country A has comparative advantage in wheat. And country B has comparative advantage in fish. Now again, if you look at number 1 and 2, country A has comparative advantage in wheat for number 1, and country B has comparative advantage in the production of fish, which is true, but answer choice 1 says that country A has absolute advantage in both commodities, which is true, because they make 6 and they make 3 wheat. So they have absolute advantage and then comparative advantage in wheat. So 1 is true. And number 3 is saying that 1 wheat for 2.5 fish would be a good trade. Now, is that a good trade? Well, let's take a look. If the opportunity cost of 1 wheat is 3 fish. Now keep in mind, country A is comparative advantage in wheat, so they're going to produce wheat. So instead of producing wheat, they could have produced 2 fish. Well, if they focus on producing the wheat and instead trade for 2.5 fish, well, 2.5 is going to be better than 2 fish. So that's a good trade for them, and it works the other way around as well. If it's the case that country B would have made, because they're foregoing production of wheat, they're making fish, they make 3 fish, and so they could have made 1 wheat, but they made 3 fish. Well, instead, they'll make those 3 fish, and they'll trade 2.5 fish for 1 wheat. So this is a mutually advantageous trade. So 1 and 3 are correct. So the correct answer is D, which is 1 and 3. This question, it's really hard to get around working this out. There's a lot of layers to this problem, so you might spend a little bit more time. It's not one of the key macro things that you go on later on, but it is a little bit of a time-intensive problem. So you want to make sure you know how to do this and be able to understand comparative advantage correctly to be able to answer this. Okay, question number 2. It's a lot more straightforward here. Suppose that the consumer price index rises from 100 to 200. So prices have doubled for this particular price index. So what does that mean here? So is it A, each person's real income is cut in half? No, your purchasing power is reduced. Consumers' income are doubled? No, that's opposite. C, the prices in an average consumer's market basket are doubled. So again, this is just a price index is a market basket. So the answer is that the price in an average consumer's market basket doubles. Now let's go over why D and E would not be correct either. All consumer goods prices are doubled. Again, price index only measures a basket of goods. And E, all prices in the economy are doubled, which again, there's no way to measure all the prices in the economy specifically through a price index. So question number 3. In the graph above, AD denotes the aggregate demand curve, SRAS the short-run aggregate supply curve, and LRAS the long-run aggregate supply curve. If no policy action were taken, which of the following changes would move the economy to its long run? All right, so this is something that we've dealt with thoroughly in the lectures here. So if you've gone through the lectures, you have a good idea of how to do this here. So here's the price level, or the aggregate price level, but they did not mention this. And here's the real output, or the real GDP right here. And so I'm just redrawing this graph here. Here's the aggregate demand. And here's the short-run aggregate supply. And then the LRAS is going to be to the left here. So what's basically going on here, again, I'm going to add on here. This is Y1 here, and this is the potential output. So you have here of what's called this inflationary gap. So how does the government get rid of an inflationary gap? Through contractionary, either fiscal or monetary policy. So this is if the government does something, right? Now, if it's a case where in this particular problem, if no policy action were taken, which of the following changes would move the economy to its long-run equilibrium? Would it be A, increase in aggregate demand, B, increase in exports, C, increase in wages, D, decrease in wages, or E, decrease in the expected price level? So what's going to happen is that eventually, because the economy is heating up, there's going to be an increase in wages because the SRAS will naturally shift back to the left here. SRAS shifts back to SRAS2. And so if no policy action was taken, then there's just going to be an increase in wages. And the increase in wages will slow the economy, so to speak, more, and the SRAS is going to shift back to the left here. So question number 4. Suppose that national government increased deficit spending on goods and services, increasing its demand for loanable funds. In the long run, this policy would most likely result in which of the following changes in this country here? So this is basically looking at the crowding out effect. So what is the crowding out effect? So the crowding out effect is when the government borrows money. Here's how does it look when the government borrows money here on the supply and demand of loanable funds. So here's the quantity of loanable funds. And here's R, here's the interest rate. And here's the demand for loanable funds. Here's the supply for loanable funds. When the government spends uses deficit spending, then the demand for loanable funds will increase here. And what happens is the R increases here. So R1 goes to R2. So we know that the R increases here. So real interest rate increases. So you could cancel out A, B, and E are incorrect because A and B say decrease and E says no change here. Now what happens to investment? Well, remember the equation Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. So when R increases, consumption and business investment goes down. And so in this particular case here, Y goes down as well, but the second part to the problem is what happens to investment in the long run, and investment decreases. So the answer is going to be C, which is increase real interest rate and decrease investment. So that's question number 4. Let's go on to question number 5. Number 5, I think, might be one of the more trickier problems on the test. So make sure you pay attention to what it's saying here. In an economy with lump sum taxes and no international trade, if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, so the MPC is 0.8, which of the following is true? All right, so if you have the marginal propensity to consume, then you're going to have the marginal propensity to save equals 1 minus 0.8. So the marginal propensity to save is 0.2. Okay, so if consumption, so if savings is, let's say, if savings here is $1, then consumption equals $4 because the marginal propensity to consume is 80% and the marginal propensity to save is 20%. So $1 savings equals $4 worth of consumption. And so the income would be $5. So this is kind of the ratio you're looking for here. And if that's true, then that's the correct answer choice here. So for part A, when consumption increases by $5, investment increases by $1. Now, one thing here is investment equals savings. So you can say that savings increases by $1. So this is close. A is kind of close, but $5 means that investment or savings is going to increase by a little bit more than $1, not a maximum of $1. If consumption increases by $5, savings increases by a maximum of $1. Again, if investment equals savings, it's going to be a little bit more than $1. When investment increases by $1, so in savings is also investment, income increases by $5. And so C is the correct answer. D, investment increases by $1, consumption $5, income increases by $1, investment increases by $1. So the answer is C. C, if investment goes up by $1, goes up by $1, then income goes up by $5. So that's the ratio that we're looking for right there. Okay, question number 6. If the government increases expenditures on goods and services and increases taxations by the same amount, which of the following occurs? Okay, so here's government fiscal policy. So it's a combination of expansionary and contractionary. So let's raise government spending and also raise taxes. So this is the expansionary and this is contractionary. However, under a Keynesian model here, there's a money multiplier formula, and the money multiplier formula is such that you have the government spending is 1 over MPC. So here's a government spending multiplier, and the tax multiplier is MPC over, I'm sorry, this is 1 over 1 minus MPC. The tax multiplier is 1 over, or MPC minus 1 minus MPC. So let's say the marginal propensity to consume was 0.8. The multiplier here is 1 over 1 minus 0.8, which equals 1 over 0.2. So the multiplier is going to be 5. Here, when you're dealing with increase in taxes, then you increase kind of like the negative amount, so to speak. So the negative multiplier is going to be negative 0.8 over 1 minus 0.8. So the negative multiplier is going to be negative 0.8 over 0.2, which is negative 4. So when you raise taxes, you get an injection of 5 times the amount. But when you raise government spending, but when you raise taxes, you're decreasing by less than the amount. So the answer is going to be B. Aggregate demand will increase, not unchanged. That'd be kind of the trick answer. So when you raise government spending and you raise taxes by the same amount, the impact of the government savings is going to be greater than that of the cut in taxes. So this is the rationale for the government to spend money in order to stimulate the economy rather than to cut taxes. Okay, question number 7. So we're a third of the way through here after this here. To counteract a recession, the Federal Reserve should do what? To counteract a recession. So this one's really easy. Again, if you read the answer choices, understanding the question before answering the question is much better here. How do you counteract a recession here? So recession, you want to counteract by using expansionary monetary policy. So there are 3 conventional things that you want to know for this AP exam that will expand the economy or to counteract a recession here. Number 1 is lower the discount, or for all intents and purposes, let's say the federal funds rate as well. Although technically, again, the Federal Reserve, what they do is they lower the target federal funds rate by buying government securities, but they just lump that in there. Or 2, lower the required reserve ratio. And 3, they can buy, which will bloat government securities. So any combination of these 3 things will counteract the recession by expanding the economy. So look at A, raise the reserve requirement. So A is incorrect. B, sell government securities and raise the discount rate. That will not be good as well. C, sell government securities. Again, wrong. And lower the discount rate. That works, but you just sold government securities and that's wrong. D is buy government securities. Excellent. But raise the discount rate? No. E, buy government securities and lower the discount rate. Correct. So the answer is going to be E, which is buy securities plus lower discount rate. So this is straight monetary policy. Very straightforward question here. Question number 8. Number 8, let's deal with, based on the diagram here. So I'm going to redraw the diagram here for you here. So you have real gross domestic product here, and you have the aggregate price level, and you have the aggregate supply, which is actually the SRAS, and you have the aggregate demand, the AD here. And that's all that they drew right here. Based on the diagram, what effect will an increase in the world supply of oil have on the real gross domestic product and the price level? Well, that one's really easy here. It's a shift to the right of the SRAS. So now you have the SRAS 2 here. And what happens to the price level? Well, the price level goes from P1 to P2, so the price level goes down, and the GDP output goes from Y1 to Y2. So price level goes down, real GDP goes up. So the answer is E, which is increase our GDP plus decrease the price level. Okay, so let's move on to question number 9 here. So if the government simultaneously engages in expansionary monetary and fiscal policies, which of the following is the effect on interest rates and employment? All right, so let's take a look at monetary policy. So let's look at the money market graph. So again, these are multiple choice questions, but being able to draw the graphs really helps you out for the multiple choice as well as the FRQ here. So here's the money market graph here. So here's the quantity of money, and here's the money demand, and here's the nominal interest rate. Okay, now, and here's the money supply. So if the Fed is going to use expansionary monetary policy, then MS goes to MS2, and interest rates are going to go down. So interest rate goes down. Okay. Now for fiscal policy, well, let's take a look at the loanable. So this is the money market. This is the money market graph. And here it will be the loanable funds. So this is going to be the quantity of loanable funds. So supply of loanable funds, demand for loanable funds. And again, here's the interest rate. Let's call this R1 here. And when the government uses expansionary fiscal policy, then it's going to spend more money, right? So it's going to incur a deficit. And so if there's deficit, there's a crowding out effect. Demand shifts to the right, DL2 here. And what you have is real interest rates will go up here. Okay, so you have interest rates going down here and interest rates going up as a result of both policies. And so the answer is either D or E, indeterminate. Now, what's going to happen to unemployment? Again, expansionary fiscal policy and expansionary monetary policy, if you drew SRAS AD graph, the AD would shift to the right and the GDP would increase and therefore unemployment would decrease. So the answer is D. Interest rates, you're not sure, indeterminate, and unemployment, is going to go down. So the answer is going to be D for that one. Question number 10. So another Federal Reserve question. So if you don't know anything about the Federal Reserve, this practice test is an indicator that you're going to see a lot of Federal Reserve questions here. If the Federal Reserve sells a lot of government securities in the open market, which of the following is going to occur? So sell securities equals shrink. So here's the mnemonic, S and S, shrink the money supply. So if there's no answer choice that says shrink the money supply, basically whatever step will lead to the shrinkage of money supply is the correct answer here. So A, the total amount of loans made by commercial banks will decrease. Well, to me, that sounds like a shrinking of money supply. So total loans by banks shrinks or decreases. Decrease and shrink, they're basically the same thing. So the answer is A. B, the total of loans made by commercial banks will increase. No, if they buy government securities, the money supply will increase. B and C are basically saying the same thing. Rates of interest will decrease. No, that's not going to happen. And E, rates of interest and amount of loans made by commercial banks will remain unchanged. And that's not necessarily the case here. So selling securities will mean that banks will have more IOUs, and therefore they're going to make less loans out to individuals. Okay, question number 11. Let's deal with the purchase of bonds, another Federal Reserve question. So again, a theme of understanding how to get a 5 on the AP exam. The purchase of bonds by the Federal Reserve will have the greatest effect on real gross domestic product if which of the following exists in the economy. So let's say part question part A here. We've gone over this several times, so let's analyze the question choices and see if it's right or wrong. So the A says that the required reserve ratio is high, and interest rate has a large effect on investment spending. Okay, so part B is the RR is high again, and interest rate small effect on investment spending. C is the required reserve ratio is low, and interest rate has large effect on economy. And D, required reserve ratio is low, and also the MPC is low. And E is the MPC is high, and interest rate has small effect on investment spending. So basically, this is just an understanding of the Federal Reserve and the role that money plays in stimulating the economy here. So if the reserve ratio is lower, it's going to have a greater impact on the economy. And why is that the case? Well, if the reserve ratio is lower, then more money is going to be able to be spent out, and the multiplier effect is going to be greater. So if the reserve ratio is 100%, then there's not a whole lot of money that's going to cure the problem. Whereas if the reserve ratio is pretty low, then more money circulates. So let's erase all the high, where the required reserve ratio is high. So it's going to be either C, D, or E here. Now, interest rates, do we want to have a large or a small impact? It's probably going to be a larger impact because, if it's the case that more money is circulating into the economy, then if interest rates have a huge impact, then that means that more loans will be made out. So interest rate has, so part D, required reserve ratio is low, but if the MPC is low, then we don't want that. We want the MPC to be high. So part E, MPC is high, but the interest rate has small effect, so that's incorrect. So by default, the answer is going to be C, where the required reserve ratio is low, but there's a large effect on the economy. So the answer is C right there. Okay, number 12. Which of the following will most likely occur as a result of an increase in labor productivity in the economy? So if there's an increase in labor productivity, what's going to happen on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph? What's going to be affected? Well, it's the aggregate supply is going to shift to the right. And so if the aggregate supply curve shifts to the right, AS, and you have AD here, you're going to have lower rate of lower price level, and you have GDP from Y1 to Y2, so that's an increase in output. So the answer is going to be A, an increase in output and a decrease in inflation because the price level went down. Yeah. Let's look at number 13. 13 is, again, pretty straightforward here. Which of the following is most likely to cause, so just to review here, number 12 is A, which is an increase in output and a decrease in inflation. So number 13, which of the following is most likely to cause an increase in the international value of the US dollar? So is it higher US real interest rates, lower US government expenditures, higher real interest rates abroad, expansionary monetary policy in the US, or reduced inflation abroad? Okay, so what's going to happen is that if interest rates are high, so in the United States, if there are higher interest rates, people are going to want to put their money in the United States, and therefore the demand for the US dollar is going to increase, and so the answer is A. So higher real interest rates will increase the demand for the US dollar. That makes perfect sense. Absolutely. Let's take a look at question number 14 here. On a short-run Phillips curve, high rates of inflation coincide with which of the following here? Let's just use this as an opportunity to draw the Phillips curve here. So unemployment rate is going to be on the x-axis here, and then inflation rate, don't just put I because that could be confused with interest. Inflation rate. And let's go ahead and draw the short-run Phillips curve here. So here's the short-run Phillips curve, SRPC here. Let's call this point A. Okay, so let's say this is high unemployment, but you have low inflation. And then B, you have low unemployment, but you have high inflation here. So high rates of inflation coincide with low unemployment rates. So the answer is D. Unemployment that's low. Now again, this is a short-run Phillips curve. Now how would the LRPC look like? The LRPC, there's no relationship between unemployment and inflation here. This is a natural non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, the NAIRU. So there is no relationship between inflation and unemployment in the long run. In the short run, they're inversely related. Absolutely. Okay, question number 15. If the required reserve ratio is 25%, so let's change it to 0.25, because 25% is 0.25, and banks held no excess reserves, meaning all the money that they can lend out, they do lend out. And there's an open market sale of $400,000 of government securities by the Federal Reserve. What's going to happen? So sale of $400,000. Okay, so a sale is a shrinkage of the money supply. So the answer is going to be a decrease. So based on that, you can eliminate A, C, and D, because A, C, and D are all going to increase the money supply. So how do you figure out using the multiplier formula here? So this is how money is created here. You take the initial amount here, so negative $400,000 is going to be contracted, so to speak, and you multiply that 1 over 0.25, which equals negative 400,000 times 4. So there's a contraction of $1.6 million from the economy. So the answer is going to be B, a decrease in the money supply of $1.6 million. Number 16. 16 is pretty straightforward again here. An increase in which of the following would cause an increase in the aggregate supply? So increase in SRAS. So is it labor productivity, the wage rate, price of imports, consumer spending, or interest rates? This seems like a question that was already tackled in a previous question here. So if there's an increase in labor productivity, then aggregate supply increases. So you don't really have to even go past A. Aggregate supply increases. So the answer is going to be A. Let's take a look at number 17 here. Which of the following is true when the velocity of money falls? So this one is actually something that I may not have gone over specifically through the equation, or I may have just referenced really briefly here. So the money equation is as follows. MV equals PY. So M represents the amount of money in the economy. V represents the velocity, so how fast the money is circulated. And that necessarily is going to equal the price level times the amount of goods that is spent. So the Y value, all the stuff that is spent, all the money, the GDP, so to speak here. So Y. So PY is going to be the nominal GDP here. So what happens when velocity falls down? So if velocity falls down, then either the price level or the GDP, something has gone down right here. So A makes the most sense, and I'll go over this a little bit more. A makes sense because an increase in the money supply, so if you counteract the lack of velocity or the amount of money that's circulating, if you increase the money supply, increase in M will have a lesser effect on nominal GDP. Okay, because here's the nominal GDP. So if velocity goes down, then if you counteract that by raising the money supply, it's not going to have as much of an effect. A change in money supply will affect output only. No, if change in money supply will affect the nominal GDP. The Federal Reserve will decrease the money supply. No, that's actually, it would make the problem worse. If people aren't spending money and the money supply decreases, then the nominal GDP is going to go down even further. Output will be greater for a given money supply. No, because if this goes down, then output is going to go down as well. The public will increase its holdings of assets other than money. No, if velocity goes down, that means people are actually holding on to more money rather than less money. So the answer here is A. Okay, question number 18. 18 is kind of a combination of previous questions here. So one thing to be aware of is what is the impact not only of expansionary and monetary policy on the economy and unemployment, but what is the impact on interest rates? So there's a couple questions on that here. So stimulative fiscal policy and a restrictive monetary policy. So a stimulative fiscal policy would be expansionary. So expansionary fiscal policy, okay, so it increases GDP, lowers unemployment, and it raises interest rates. Where you have a contractionary monetary policy is going to lower GDP, raise unemployment, and raise interest rates. So this particular problem says, what happens when you combine these two things together, expansionary fiscal policy and contractionary monetary policy? Well, A, gross domestic product increases. Well, one it increases, but one it decreases here. Gross domestic product to decrease. Again, one increases fiscal policy, increases GDP, expansionary or stimulative, and contractionary will lower it. So A and B is right individually, but not together. Interest rates fall. No, in both cases, interest rates are going to rise. So the answer is D. Interest rates rise. Okay, so 3 more questions here and we'll be done with this particular sample question here. Assume that Canadian consumers increase their demand for Mexican financial assets. How would the international supply of Canadian dollars, the value of the Mexican peso relative to Canadian dollar, and Canadian net exports to Mexico change? So this is kind of a layered question here, but they tell you how would the international supply of Canadian dollars. And so that is the key to understanding this problem here. Here's the international supply of Canadian dollars. Here's the international demand of Canadian dollars. So this is the quantity of Canadian dollars here. And so here's peso per Canadian dollar. So what happens is when there's an increase in demand for Mexican financial assets, then the international supply of Canadian dollars is going to increase from S1 to S2. So what's going to happen? Q1 to Q2. So E1 to E2 here. So the Canadian dollar, what it does is going to, when it used to, used to trade 1 Canadian dollar for 1 peso, now 1 Canadian dollar isn't going to get as much. So the Canadian dollar is going to depreciate. But guess what? They're not asking you for that here. So we know that the supply of Canadian dollars is going to increase. and we know that the Canadian dollar depreciates, so you have to convert that to the peso. The peso will increase, so it'll appreciate, so the peso will increase here, even though the Canadian dollar will decrease in value. The peso, the Mexican peso, will increase in value. Now, if the Canadian dollar depreciates, then that is good for businesses because a cheaper Canadian export is going to increase the aggregate demand because imports are going to increase. So imports increase as well. So the answer for this is increase, 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 A. The supply of Canadian dollars will increase. The value of the peso will increase because the value of the Canadian dollar will decrease. And Canadian net exports are going to increase, and therefore the aggregate demand is also going to increase as well. So the answer is A. Final two questions here. Okay, question number 20. If nominal GDP fell, so nominal GDP falls while real GDP increases, which of the following must be true? So generally, this is kind of an odd situation because nominal GDP, when nominal GDP goes up, the real GDP didn't necessarily go up because of inflation. So what's saying is that if real GDP has gone up and nominal GDP has gone down, it necessarily indicates that the prices have also fallen. So productivity. So how do you find, let's say in a simple economy, there's only bananas. So how do you chart the situation here? This is obviously a little bit more extensive than what would be required here. But let's say this economy that's bananas here. Let's say $1 here and they sell 1,000 here. So the GDP, so nominal GDP, would be 1,000. And the real GDP is also 1,000. Now, what the situation means that, let's say in the year 2001, the price drops to, let's say, 50 cents, but the quantity, let's say, it increased to 1,600. So the nominal GDP in this case would be 800, and the real GDP here would be 1,600. So something like this, if the nominal GDP went down but the real GDP went up, then it's the price that went up rather than, or the price that went down. So there was a lowering of inflation rather than a lowering of economic growth here. So the answer here was, it's not that unemployment increased. These are good things here. So quantity increase. Inflation rate was negative here. So in this case, $1 to 50 cents here. So inflation rate is negative, meaning that prices have gone down. Net exports were negative, not necessarily. Average of stock prices while bond prices fell, no. Nominal interest rates rose by less than the rate of inflation, no. It's the inflation rate that went down here. Question number 21. An increase in which of the following would reduce the U.S. balance of trade deficit here? So let's take a look at the answer choices. A, U.S. demand for which of the following would reduce the U.S. balance of trade deficits? United States demand for foreign goods, the United States rate of inflation compared to other countries here. So if the United States demand for foreign goods increased, then imports would go up relative to exports, and that's not good for the deficit, trade deficit. United States rate of inflation, if that increases, then that's again not a good thing because you would have an increased balance of trade deficit. Now, if the value of the foreign currency relative to the U.S. dollar, if that increases, so let's say the euro. So the euro value increases. Well, that necessarily means that the dollar value decreases or depreciates. So if it depreciates, it's cheaper, and recall the equation y equals c plus I plus g plus nx. So what's going to happen is that when the value depreciates, nx here is going to increase here because $100, let's say, equals 100 euros. So if the euro value goes up, then you have 100 euros equals, let's say, $150. And let's say you're selling a US good that you're selling for $100. Well, it's $100, and then when the euro has appreciated, you can sell that same exact thing that used to be $100. Now, $100 equals, again, not exactly, but 67 euros. Okay. You as an American business, you only care about that $100. So you don't care if you're getting 100 euros. I mean, you do care because of the exchange rate, but because the exchange rate is now favorable for the euro, your good is actually seen as better. So the balance of trade goes, the trade deficit is going to decrease if the value of foreign currency relative to the US dollar, if that increases. If the federal budget deficit increases, that's not going to have that's not going to reduce the balance of trade. And if the U.S. interest rate increases, again, that's not going to that's not going to reduce the balance of trade. So hopefully you see the connection between these things. And hopefully these 21 problems here gives you a sample idea of what's required to pass this AP macroeconomics exam. Thank you for watching educator.com.